The moment 17-year-old Marcus Villanueva pointed his manicured finger at Manny Pacquiao and laughed, the entire Manila Convention Center seemed to hold its breath. Camera phones lifted like a forest of glass and light as the teenage influencer, draped in designer brands worth more than most Filipino families earned in a year, stood before the boxing legend who had carried an entire nation's hopes on his scarred shoulders. Behind them, dozens of children from Tondo's poorest neighborhoods sat cross-legged on the floor, their worn slippers and faded shirts a stark contrast to Marcus's limited edition sneakers that cost thousands of dollars. The charity event had been organized to distribute school supplies and food packages, but Marcus had arrived with his usual entourage, treating the occasion like just another backdrop for his social media empire. His followers numbered in the millions, mostly other privileged teenagers who lived in the bubble of gated communities and international schools, disconnected from the struggling reality that most Filipinos faced daily. When Manny approached to greet him respectfully, Marcus saw only an opportunity for viral content, not a hero who had fought his way out of crushing poverty. The air conditioning hummed softly overhead, but the atmosphere grew suffocating as Marcus prepared to speak words that would change his life forever. "You're just an old boxer who got lucky," Marcus announced loudly, his voice dripping with casual cruelty as he held his phone at the perfect selfie angle. The words cut through the murmur of the crowd like a blade, sharp and intentional, designed for maximum shock value and engagement. Manny's weathered face remained calm, his eyes holding depths of experience that the boy couldn't begin to comprehend, having never known hunger or humiliation. Marcus continued his performance, emboldened by his phone's recording light and the nervous laughter from his friends clustered behind him like well-dressed shadows. "My father's portfolio earned more last month than your entire career, and he didn't have to get punched in the face for it," the teenager added, his lips curled in a smirk that had been perfected through thousands of Instagram posts. The children behind them shifted uncomfortably, their eyes wide with disbelief that anyone could speak to their hero this way. In that crystallized moment, Marcus uploaded the video with shaking hands, convinced he had just created his masterpiece, completely unaware he had just recorded the beginning of his own transformation. The black SUV arrived at Forbes Park's imposing gates 3 days after the video had scorched through every Filipino social media platform like wildfire through dry grass. Security guards straightened instinctively when they recognized the humble figure in the back seat, the man whose fists had brought glory to their nation across decades of brutal combat. Manny Pacquiao had not come with cameras or press releases, only a quiet determination that had carried him through 8 weight divisions and countless impossible odds. Inside the Villanueva mansion, Marcus lounged on imported furniture, his phone buzzing incessantly with notifications, while his parents dismissed angry messages from sponsors as temporary noise. When the housekeeper announced Manny's presence, Marcus's eyes lit up with predatory excitement, already imagining the content opportunities of round 2. His mother barely glanced up from her wine. His father remained locked in his study, both too absorbed in their insulated world to recognize the magnitude of what was unfolding. Marcus descended the curved marble staircase with deliberate slowness, his phone already positioned to capture every angle, every word, every reaction that might fuel his next viral moment. The living room stretched vast and cold, despite its expensive furnishings, art pieces worth fortunes hanging on walls that had never known struggle or sacrifice. Manny stood near the entrance, respectful even in this palace of privilege, his calloused hands clasped before him like a farmer seeking audience with royalty. The contrast struck like lightning, this icon of perseverance facing a boy whose greatest hardship had been waiting for his luxury car delivery. Marcus expected confrontation, perhaps legal threats or publicity stunts, anything that would feed the narrative he controlled through filters and carefully edited clips. Instead, Manny's voice emerged soft as rain on tired earth, carrying weight that expensive speakers could never reproduce. I want to invite you to my home in General Santos City for 1 week to see where champions are really made. The request landed in the opulent room like a stone in still water, rippling outward in ways Marcus couldn't immediately process or manipulate into content. His first instinct was mockery, another dismissive laugh to share with his followers who fed on his carefully constructed superiority. But something in Manny's unwavering gaze stopped the words in his throat. This wasn't a challenge born of wounded pride or a publicity counterattack, but something far more unsettling, an invitation into a world Marcus had spent his entire pampered existence avoiding. The teenager's mind raced through possibilities, imagining poverty tourism content, dramatic transformation videos, perhaps even a redemption arc that could rehabilitate his brand with sponsors. Manny simply waited with the patience of someone who had survived 12 round wars, knowing that real change couldn't be rushed or performed for cameras. Marcus heard himself accepting before fully understanding why, perhaps sensing that refusal would expose a cowardice deeper than any his followers could forgive. The deal was sealed with a handshake that felt like crossing into territory his privilege had never mapped. The chartered plane descended through clouds that parted like curtains, revealing a stage Marcus had never imagined existed beyond his filtered reality. General Santos City sprawled beneath him, a tapestry of corrugated roofs and vibrant streets where life pulsed without permission from algorithms or engagement metrics. Manny sat across the aisle, reading quietly, his presence radiating a calm that made Marcus's constant phone-checking feel juvenile and desperate. The humidity hit like a wall when they stepped onto the tarmac, thick and honest, carrying scents of ocean salt and grilling fish that no luxury candle could authentically replicate. Marcus's designer luggage looked absurd beside Manny's single-worn duffel bag, a visual metaphor the teenager was only beginning to comprehend. They drove through neighborhoods where children played barefoot in streets his gated world had trained him to fear, their laughter somehow fuller than anything he'd heard echoing through marble hallways. Manny's hand rested on the car window frame, his eyes softening with recognition at every corner, every face, every humble structure that had shaped the warrior the world came to worship. The house where Manny grew up stood modest and unapologetic, its weathered walls holding more history than Marcus's mansion, despite occupying a fraction of the space. Neighbors emerged like family, their embraces genuine and unperformed, celebrating Manny's return with a warmth that couldn't be manufactured or bought. Marcus felt their eyes on him, knowing glances that carried awareness of his viral cruelty, yet their greetings remained respectful, almost pitying. An elderly woman pressed bibinka into his hands, the sweet rice cake still warm, her calloused fingers briefly touching his soft ones in a gesture that felt like blessing rather than condemnation. Manny introduced him simply as a guest learning about their home, offering no explanations or justifications that might have shamed the boy further. The teenager stood awkward and overdressed in his streetwear brands, suddenly understanding that real wealth had nothing to do with price tags or follower counts. As the sun descended, painting the sky in golds and crimsons, Marcus realized this wasn't poverty tourism or content opportunity, but an invitation into dignity he'd mistaken for weakness. Dinner happened at a long table, surrounded by people who had known Manny before fame transformed him into legend, their stories revealing the man beneath the championship belts. They spoke of his generosity during typhoons, scholarships for struggling students, quiet acts of service performed without press releases or social media announcements. Marcus picked at his food while listening to tales of a community that had lifted Manny up and how he'd spent decades lifting them back in return. A young boy asked Marcus about Manila with innocent curiosity, not judgment, forcing the teenager to describe his world through eyes that now saw its hollowness. Manny watched silently, letting the evening's organic lessons penetrate deeper than any lecture could reach. The conversation flowed in. Tagalog and English, a musical blend that made Marcus feel like a foreigner in his own country. When someone asked him to share about himself, Marcus found his usual bragging points dissolving on his tongue, replaced by unprecedented uncertainty about who he actually was beneath the constructed persona. The night settled heavy and honest as Marcus lay on a sleeping mat in Manny's childhood room, the sounds of the neighborhood filtering through windows that knew no air conditioning. Distant dogs barked their territorial songs. Motorcycles hummed past carrying workers to night shifts. A baby cried and was soothed by a mother's lullaby that drifted through thin walls. His phone sat silent. Beside him, its battery dying like his connection to the artificial world that had defined his worth through metrics and validation. Manny's breathing was steady in the darkness, the champion resting with the peace of someone who had nothing left to prove. Marcus stared at the ceiling, where water stains mapped continents of struggle his privilege had never navigated, feeling the first cracks forming in the armor of entitlement that had protected him from genuine human connection. Tomorrow would bring training at dawn, a concept foreign to someone whose mornings began when trending topics demanded his attention. For the first time in his 17 years, Marcus felt the weight of who he wasn't and the terrifying possibility of who he might become. The rooster's crow shattered Marcus's sleep at 4:30 in the morning, a biological alarm clock that recognized no snooze button or negotiation. Manny was already dressed in training clothes worn soft from countless pre-dawn sessions, his movements quiet and purposeful in the dimness. Marcus fumbled for his phone instinctively before remembering its dead battery, feeling phantom anxiety at the disconnection from his digital lifeline. The champion waited patiently by the door, offering no judgment as the teenager struggled into borrowed shorts and an oversized shirt that smelled of sun-dried cotton. They stepped into streets still dark and cool, the city breathing its last peaceful moments before the day's hustle began. Other early risers nodded to Manny with familiar respect, their own journeys to markets and fishing boats already underway. Marcus's legs felt heavy with resistance against this unnatural hour, his body protesting a schedule it had never been. Trained to honor, the gym materialized from the darkness like a temple of transformation, its open walls inviting the morning air to witness the sacred work happening within. Young fighters were already shadowboxing, their forms precise despite the humble surroundings, their dedication rendering expensive equipment unnecessary. Manny handed Marcus worn gloves that had shaped countless champions, the leather cracked but still holding the dreams pressed into them. The teenager's first punches were awkward and performative, muscle movements designed for mirror selfies rather than actual combat. Manny adjusted his stance with gentle hands, positioning his feet and hips with the patience of someone who understood that real change required proper foundation. Sweat emerged quickly in the humid air, soaking through Marcus's borrowed clothes as his pampered body encountered demands it had never faced. The other fighters trained around him without mockery, their focus inward on their own battles, teaching through example what discipline actually looked like. By the time pale light began filtering through the gym's open sides, Marcus's arms trembled with exhaustion, his breath coming in desperate gasps. Manny had barely broken a sweat, his conditioning earned through decades of commitment. The boy was only beginning to comprehend. They moved to roadwork, joining a route Manny had run as a hungry child, dreaming of escape through excellence rather than entitlement. The champion's pace was measured and kind, allowing Marcus to struggle alongside rather than fall hopelessly behind. Neighbors sweeping their doorways called out encouragement to the suffering teenager, their kindness somehow making his privilege feel more shameful. Marcus wanted to quit with every burning breath, but something about Manny's steady presence beside him made surrender feel like a betrayal. When they finally stopped, the city was fully awake, and Marcus had survived his first honest morning in 17 years. Manny bought them lugar from a street vendor, the rice porridge simple and perfect, fuel earned rather than mindlessly consumed. They sat on plastic stools while the city flowed around them, Marcus too exhausted for performance or pretense. The champion ate slowly, letting the morning's lessons settle without words, understanding that transformation happened in silence between the noise. Marcus tasted the porridge and found it delicious in ways his chef-prepared meals had never achieved. Hunger revealing flavors, entitlement had obscured. Around them, General Santos City continued its daily resurrection, proof that greatness emerged from struggle rather than comfort. Manny's eyes held quiet satisfaction, recognizing the beginning of something authentic, breaking through the boy's carefully constructed facade. The real work was only starting, but foundations were being laid in sweat and humility that might actually hold. The tindahan owner recognized Marcus immediately when he stumbled in searching for bottled water. Her weathered face softening with an expression he couldn't identify at first because he'd never encountered it before. Pity mixed with determination to teach rather than punish. She poured him cold water from her pitcher instead, refusing his crumpled bills with a gentle wave, explaining in careful English that hospitality wasn't transactional in their community. Her grandson had shared the viral video days ago, yet here she stood, offering kindness to the boy who'd mocked their greatest hero, demonstrating a grace that made Marcus's throat tight with unfamiliar shame. Other customers watched the interaction with quiet interest, their eyes measuring him not with the hatred he'd expected, but with cautious hope that maybe he was capable of learning. Manny observed from the doorway, letting the moment unfold without interference, trusting his community to deliver lessons no lecture could provide. The old woman pressed a banana into Marcus's hand before he left, telling him that growing boys needed fuel for honest work, her wrinkled hands blessing rather than condemning. At the public market where Manny had once sold goods as a child, vendors called out greetings that included Marcus by proximity to the champion, their acceptance provisional but genuine. A fishmonger invited them to taste his fresh catch, explaining the pre-dawn ocean journey that brought it to these tables, his pride in his labor needing no Instagram validation. Marcus noticed how people touched Manny's shoulder in passing, these brief contacts speaking of shared history and mutual respect that celebrity culture could never manufacture. The teenage vendor at the vegetable stall asked Marcus where he was from with unguarded curiosity, her question free of judgment, as if his viral cruelty existed in a separate reality from this. A morning's encounter. Manny purchased ingredients for dinner from multiple stalls, distributing his business among neighbors who depended on each transaction, demonstrating leadership through economic kindness. Marcus carried the bags without being asked, some instinct awakening that recognized service as strength rather than weakness. The markets, cacophony wrapped around them like belonging, teaching the boy that community was built through daily choices to show up for each other. The breakthrough came unexpectedly at the basketball court, where neighborhood kids played with a ball, held together by tape and determination, their joy uncomplicated by the poverty that would have paralyzed Marcus's privileged friends. They invited him to join without hesitation, these children who should have hated him, offering inclusion as their default setting, shaming him with generosity he'd never earned. Marcus played awkwardly, his expensive training sessions worthless against their street-learned skills and instinctive teamwork. When he fell, out on the concrete, skinning his pampered knees, 3 kids immediately stopped playing to help him up, their small hands surprisingly strong. One boy offered his last piece of candy to Marcus, split carefully in half so both could share, an act of radical abundance from someone who had nothing. Manny watched from the sidelines, his expression, holding pride not for Marcus's fumbling basketball skills, but for his willingness to receive these painful gifts of grace. The teenager sat on the court afterward, bleeding knees forgotten, finally understanding that he'd insulted people whose humanity had always exceeded his own. The alarm shattered Marcus's sleep at 4:30 in the morning, darkness still pressing against the windows like a physical weight. Manny stood in the doorway, already dressed in training clothes, his silhouette carved from discipline accumulated across decades of pre-dawn dedication. They walked through streets where other shadows moved with purpose toward markets and docks, the city's hidden circulatory system, pumping life before privileged people like Marcus ever opened their eyes. The gym materialized from the gloom, its exterior humble beyond anything Marcus had associated with championship training, walls scarred by decades of sweat and ambition. Inside, the heavy bag waited like a judgment, its leather surface darkened by the hands of fighters who'd treated pain as currency for transformation. Manny wrapped Marcus's soft hands with patient precision, each loop of cloth a ritual preparation for honest suffering. The work began without ceremony, Manny's instructions economical as scripture, his expectations calibrated not to Marcus's comfort, but to his potential. 2 hours dissolved into an eternity of burning muscles and gasping lungs, Marcus's expensive athletic wear soaked through before the sun crested the horizon. Manny moved beside him through combinations that looked effortless but required total physical commitment, his 40-something body still demonstrating what dedication could sculpt from ordinary flesh. When Marcus's arms dropped from exhaustion, Manny didn't lower the pace, his voice carrying steel wrapped in encouragement, explaining that comfort was the enemy of growth. The running came next, miles through waking neighborhoods where people swept sidewalks and opened shops, their daily resurrection from poverty's grinding demands. Marcus stumbled, vomited, begged silently for mercy that Manny's steady pace refused to grant, each stride teaching lessons about the distance between wanting and becoming. His lungs screamed protests his privilege had never prepared him to endure, every breath purchased with the kind of effort he'd spent 17 years avoiding. Manny finally stopped at a viewpoint, overlooking the ocean, dawn painting everything gold, his hand resting briefly on Marcus's heaving shoulder, like a blessing earned through suffering survived together. They proceeded directly to the fish market, where Manny had worked as a child, no rest-bridging training and labor, the champion demonstrating how survival erased the luxury of recovery time. Marcus hauled crates of fish whose weight seemed impossible, his pampered muscles trembling while elderly workers moved with efficient grace born from necessity's stern teaching. The ice burned his hands, the smell overwhelmed his privileged senses. The hours stretched without the digital distractions that normally fragmented his attention. Manny worked beside him without fanfare, his status dissolved into shared labor, showing Marcus that greatness kneeled before honest work rather than standing above it. A vendor offered them breakfast, simple rice and dried fish that tasted like revelation to Marcus's exhausted body, hunger making the meal sacred. They ate with workers, whose conversation flowed around boxing and fishing and family with equal reverence, their community built through daily choices to honor rather than abandon each other. Marcus's hands shook, holding the spoon, his body screaming, something fundamental breaking open inside his chest where entitlement had lived untested for 17 years. That evening, Manny finally spoke about the morning's purpose, while Marcus soaked his battered feet in cool water, the teenager too exhausted for the defensive arrogance that had armored him before. The champion explained that talent without discipline was just potential rotting unused. That respect was earned through showing up when everything hurt. That character was forged in the hours before the world woke to judge your performance. Marcus listened with tears, cutting tracks through the dust on his face, finally understanding that Manny's greatness wasn't about the championships, but about the 10,000 mornings he'd chosen suffering over comfort. The old boxer's voice carried no anger. About the viral insult, only determination to show this lost boy that transformation required walking through fire rather than photographing it for content. Manny described his own teenage humiliation and hunger, poverty that made Marcus's hardest day look like vacation, his tone factual rather than self-pitying because survival left no energy for victimhood. Marcus nodded through his exhaustion, his body's pain translating truths his mind had refused to hear. The first day's brutal lessons cracking the shell that wealth had calcified around his heart. The afternoon heat pressed down as Manny led Marcus to the boxing gym where his own transformation had begun decades earlier. The building's corrugated metal walls radiating stored sunlight like a forge. Inside, children ranging from 8 to 16 moved through drills with fierce concentration, their worn gloves patched with tape, their shorts faded from countless washings, their eyes burning with hunger that had nothing to do with empty stomachs. Marcus recognized immediately that these kids possessed something his wealth had stolen, a clarity of purpose that made every punch meaningful, every sacrifice intentional. Manny introduced him simply as a visitor learning about boxing, sparing Marcus the shame of recognition, his generosity extending even to the boy who'd mocked him before millions. The children nodded politely and returned to their training, their focus unbroken by the presence of adults, their discipline more complete than anything Marcus had demonstrated in his privileged life. The head coach, a weathered man named Rudy, who'd trained with Manny as boys, explained that most of these fighters supported their families with amateur purses, their childhood, compressed by necessity into early adulthood. When training concluded, the children gathered for their single substantial meal of the day, rice and vegetables prepared by volunteers in battered pots behind the gym. Marcus watched them portion the food with mathematical precision, ensuring the youngest ate first, the older kids accepting smaller. Shares without complaint, their hierarchy built on protection rather than dominance. Then something happened that stopped Marcus's breath. One of the smallest boys, maybe 9 years old with a healing bruise across his cheek, approached with his plate extended toward the stranger. The child offered half his rice to Marcus, his eyes serious and dignified, his gesture carrying the weight of a sacrament that required no explanation or applause. Marcus stared at the food, understanding that this boy was giving away sustenance he genuinely needed, sharing scarcity rather than hoarding it like Marcus had hoarded abundance his entire life. Manny stood silent nearby, letting the moment teach what words never could, his presence a quiet assurance that this was the lesson they'd come to receive. Marcus accepted the rice with shaking hands, his throat too tight for speech, the simple grain suddenly precious as gold because it represented something his money couldn't purchase. The boy smiled and sat beside him, other children gradually joining, until Marcus found himself surrounded by kids who should have despised him but instead offered casual friendship. They asked about his life in Manila with genuine curiosity, their questions revealing assumptions that wealth must make him happy, their innocence about privilege somehow shaming him more than condemnation would have. Marcus tried to explain his emptiness to these children who had nothing but possessed everything that mattered, his voice breaking as he described the loneliness of his gated existence. One girl, perhaps 12, listened carefully, then said something that shattered him completely. Even poor people can be rich in their hearts, her wisdom ancient beyond her years. Manny finally spoke, his voice gentle as rain, explaining that these children were the true champions because they fought not for glory, but for each other, their generosity proving that character wasn't built by what you owned, but by what you freely gave. The evening dissolved into unexpected laughter as the children taught Marcus hand games and sang songs, their joy manufactured from nothing but shared presence, their wealth measured in friendship rather than possessions. Marcus felt something shifting in his chest where contempt and entitlement had lived unchallenged, a warmth spreading that felt dangerously like hope, like possibility, like the first breath after nearly drowning in his own shallow existence. When they finally left, the small boy who'd shared his rice hugged Marcus goodbye, his thin arms surprisingly strong, his whispered words branding themselves into Marcus's soul. "Come back and train with us." Manny walked beside the crying teenager through darkening streets, his silence more eloquent than any lecture, his hand resting briefly on Marcus's shoulder like a father's blessing. Marcus understood finally that true generosity required nothing but the willingness to see others as worthy of what little you possessed, that dignity flourished in scarcity, while entitlement rotted in abundance. The children's faces haunted him that night, their open hearts indicting everything his privilege had taught him about worth, their poverty revealing his own spiritual bankruptcy with unbearable clarity. The fifth dawn arrived with Marcus already awake, his body aching from days of unaccustomed labor, but his sleeplessness had nothing to do with physical pain. He found Manny on the small porch, overlooking the awakening city, the older man's silhouette framed against bleeding colors of sunrise, his stillness suggesting prayer or meditation, or perhaps just the patience that came from surviving impossible odds. Marcus sat heavily beside him, the weight of unshed tears pressing behind his eyes, his carefully constructed defenses finally crumbling under the relentless kindness he'd encountered in this place that should have rejected him. The words emerged broken and raw, confession spilling from wounds he'd hidden even from himself. He'd mocked Manny because his father had spent Marcus's entire childhood comparing him to the champion, measuring every report card and trophy against impossible standards until the boy learned to hate the name Pacquiao. His voice cracked, admitting that destroying Manny's reputation felt like the only way to escape his father's disappointment. That viral cruelty had been his weapon against years of feeling worthless beside a legend he could never match. Manny listened without interruption, his weathered face absorbing Marcus's pain, the way the ocean accepts rivers, infinite and patient. When silence finally settled between them, Manny began speaking in the cadence of hard-earned wisdom, his words carrying scars that made them trustworthy. He described his own father's abandonment when Manny was just 12, the man disappearing into drink and other women while his family starved, the specific agony of being rejected by the person whose approval should have been unconditional. Marcus looked up shocked, having never imagined that someone as accomplished as Manny Pacquiao could understand this particular species of worthlessness, this acid that ate through confidence until only rage remained. Manny's eyes held oceans of remembered hurt as he explained that for years he'd fought trying to prove himself to a father who never returned, his fists fueled by abandonment until he finally understood that real strength meant healing rather than wounding. He placed his hand over Marcus's, the champion's calloused fingers gentle, against the boy's soft skin, his touch communicating what words struggled to convey. "Pride," Manny said, his voice carrying the texture of gravel smoothed by countless storms, "is not what you take from others, Marcus. It's what you build in your community." He gestured toward the streets below, where vendors were setting up stalls, where children walked barefoot toward school, clutching precious notebooks, where life continued its stubborn dance despite hardship. The champion's face held no judgment, only the clarity that came from having walked through fire and emerged transformed rather than consumed. When I finally won my first world title, I didn't feel complete until I came back here, until I could help my neighbors escape the same poverty that nearly killed us. His words painted pictures of another boy who'd learned that strength wasted on vengeance poisoned the soul, while strength shared in service became immortal. Marcus listened with his entire body, leaning forward as if physical closeness might help him absorb this. Foreign philosophy, this mathematics, where giving somehow multiplied rather than diminished. Manny continued, his hands moving with unconscious grace as he spoke, each gesture punctuating truths earned through decades of discipline. Your father's comparisons were his weakness, not yours. He looked at my success and felt small, so he tried to make you into something that would restore his pride. The psychological precision of this observation hit Marcus like revelation, reframing years of perceived inadequacy into something more complex and ultimately less about his own worth. But you cannot fill another person's emptiness, hijo. You can only discover your own purpose. The Tagalog endearment landed soft as benediction, the first time any adult had called him son with such unguarded affection. Marcus felt something crack open in his chest, some calcified defense finally surrendering to the possibility of healing, to the radical notion that he might deserve kindness despite his cruelty. The rising sun painted them both in shades of gold and amber, two figures suspended between night's confession and day's possibility. I forgive you for the words at the charity event, Manny said simply, his forgiveness requiring no performance of penance, no groveling apology. But more importantly, you must learn to forgive yourself for carrying hatred that was never yours to bear. He stood, offering his hand to help Marcus rise, the gesture containing layers of meaning beyond simple courtesy. The boy took it, feeling the legendary power in that grip, but also the gentleness, the conscious choice to use strength for elevation rather than domination. As they stood together watching General Santos City wake to another day of beautiful struggle, Marcus understood for the first time that redemption was possible. In that moment, Marcus began transforming shame into purpose, pain into fuel for something beyond himself. He thought of the children at the gym who'd shared their meager lunch without hesitation, their generosity exposing the poverty of his own spirit, despite material abundance. Manny seemed to read his thoughts, nodding slowly as if witnessing a birth he'd helped deliver. "Now you understand," the champion said. "Now we can begin." 3 months felt like 3 lifetimes in the memory of transformation. And when Marcus stood before the ribbon at his youth center's entrance, he barely recognized the entitled boy who'd once weaponized cruelty for content. The building rose in his family's wealthy subdivision, but its purpose reached far beyond those gates, offering free tutoring, mentorship, and boxing training to any child, regardless of background or postal code. His parents stood awkwardly nearby, confused by their son's new trajectory, yet unable to deny the dignity replacing his former hollow arrogance. The gathered crowd included children from General Santos City who'd flown to Manila as Marcus's personal guests, their presence bridging 2 worlds that should never have been separated. Camera crews documented everything, but this time Marcus barely noticed them, his attention focused on creating something that would outlast any viral moment. When the murmur began rippling through the crowd, when heads turned and phones lifted, Marcus knew without looking that Manny had arrived, keeping a promise made during their final dawn conversation months ago. The champion moved through the crowd with that distinctive humility, stopping to embrace children, to listen to grandmothers, to be fully present in each interaction despite his legendary status. He reached Marcus and pulled him into a tight embrace, the gesture conveying pride that the boy's biological father had never managed to express. "You did this," Manny said simply, gesturing at the center, at the transformation, at the evidence that redemption was never theoretical but always practical. Marcus felt tears, threatening, overwhelmed by the weight of being seen, truly seen, by someone who understood both failure and resurrection. They cut the ribbon together, 4 hands on one pair of scissors, the symbolism lost on no one. As children poured into the center's open doors, their laughter sanctifying the space, Marcus understood that Manny's greatest victory had never been in any boxing ring, but in this multiplication of hope, this contagion of purpose spreading through everyone he touched. The Philippines itself seemed to exhale in collective recognition, the nation understanding that their champion had always fought for something larger than titles or glory. Manny represented the soul of a people who'd survived colonization, corruption, and countless attempts to diminish their spirit, yet emerged with generosity intact. His journey from crushing poverty to global icon had never been about individual escape, but collective elevation, about proving that strength rooted in service could transform entire communities. Marcus was merely the latest beneficiary of this philosophy, one more broken thing made whole by encountering authentic greatness. The youth center stood as testament to what happened when pride shifted from possession to contribution, when privilege recognized its responsibility to create bridges rather than walls. In Manny's weathered smile, in Marcus's redeemed purpose, in the children's uninhibited joy, the true championship was won. The kind that could never be taken away, because it lived not in trophies, but in transformed hearts that would themselves transform others. As sunset painted Manila's sky in defiant colors, Manny gathered the children for an impromptu training demonstration, his movements still sharp despite decades of punishment, his discipline still absolute despite achieving everything. Marcus watched from the doorway of his youth center, this monument to second chances, understanding finally that his father's comparisons had been accidentally correct, just inverted in meaning. He could never be Manny Pacquiao, nor should he try, but he could honor the champion's legacy by becoming the best version of Marcus, by using his privilege as a tool for elevation rather than separation. The children mimicked Manny's combinations with serious concentration, their futures suddenly expanded by proximity to someone who proved that circumstances of birth didn't determine destinations. When Manny caught Marcus's eye across the room and nodded once, slowly, with profound recognition, the boy understood he'd been given something more valuable than approval. He'd been entrusted with carrying forward a vision of strength that lifted rather than crushed, that included rather than excluded, that transformed shame into purpose and pain into fuel for beautiful, stubborn, unstoppable service. What legacy are you building that will outlast your own lifetime? Subscribe to witness more stories of transformation that remind us what true strength really means.